before 3000 BCE. Archaeological evidence from sites such as 𝗧𝗏𝗱𝗏𝗃 and other Neolithic settlements in the Fertile Crescent suggests that serpent motifs were central in religious iconography, often associated with fertility, the underworld, or protection, and predated widespread sun worship cults. The serpent, as a symbol of life and regeneration, appears in figurines and wall paintings, indicating that early human religious thought focused on chthonic and natural cycles before solar deities dominated in later periods. The Sumerians were the first urban civilization in southern Mesopotamia, arising around 4500 to 4000 BCE. Their origin is debated, but they likely emerged from indigenous Mesopotamian agricultural communities. Sumerian pagan religion was polytheistic, centered on city-specific deities. Each city had a patron god, such as Nomna, moon god, Inyor, Enlil, air and storms, in Nippur, in Ani-Ishtar, love and war, and other gods. Lilith appears in later Mesopotamian texts as a female night demon, Lilq, associated with storms and infant mortality. Ur of the Chaldeans, identified with modern Tel el-Muqayya in southern Iraq, was one of the prominent Sumerian cities and the biblical birthplace of Abraham. The Amorites originated in the northwestern Levant, particularly Syria. As West Semitic tribal groups, they moved eastward into Mesopotamia around the early 2nd millennium BCE. Their religion was polytheistic, centered on deities such as Amru-Martu, their ethnic god, Hadid, storm god, and Dagon, fertility god. Their religious practices blended with local Mesopotamian pantheons after migration. Abraham was born into this environment of Amorite Mesopotamian polytheism, worshipping the same gods as his ancestors, including Sin, Ishtar, Shamash, and Amru, reflecting the religion of his household and city. According to the Hebrew Bible, Abraham, portrayed as an Amorite pastoral figure, was called by Yahweh to leave Mesopotamia and travel to Canaan. Genesis 12. In the biblical narrative, Yahweh appears as a unique, singular deity in contrast to the polytheistic gods of Abraham's ancestors. However, historical and archaeological evidence indicates that Yahweh worship did not originate in Mesopotamia, but among southern Levantine nomadic groups, most likely Edomites, Midianites, or Kenites. The earliest extra-biblical reference to Yahweh appears in Egyptian records mentioning the 𝗧𝗿𝗶𝗁𝗱𝗏 in regions associated with Edom and Midian in the late 2nd millennium BCE. The patriarchs of the Bible, when narrowly defined, are Abraham, his son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob, also named Israel, the ancestral figure from whom the Israelites derive their name. These patriarchs occupy central roles in Hebrew scripture and later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, forming the theological foundation for all Abrahamic religions. In later Israelite tradition, Yahweh, the god originally tied to Edomite Midianite Kenite territory, was retroactively inserted into the ancestral line of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This process created a genealogy in which Yahweh appears fully integrated into the lives of figures who, historically, lived long before the tribes associated with Yahweh's origins came into being. The Tanakh identifies the Edomites as descendants of Esau, Isaac's elder son, and presents Midian as a son of Abraham through Keturah, making him the eponymous ancestor of the Midianites. The Kenites, linked culturally to Midian, appear in the biblical narrative as close allies of early Israel, and are considered by many scholars to have been among the earliest worshippers of Yahweh. This synthesis of genealogies and traditions illustrates how Israelite authors wove separate cultural threads, Amorite ancestry, Canaanite settlement, and southern desert Yahweh worship, into a single narrative framework. The result is the familiar biblical story of Abraham's call by Yahweh, a theological construction that overlays later religious developments onto earlier, unrelated historical contexts. Building on these observations, several scholars proposed a Kenite hypothesis, which argues that Yahweh worship originated among the Midianite Kenite groups of the southern deserts, and that Moses encountered this deity through his father-in-law Jethro, also called Reuel, a Midianite priest. Early biblical passages situate Yahweh's domain in regions such as Seir, Edom, and Midian, zones identified with Kenite and Midianite populations. While Moses' marriage to the Midianite woman Zipporah strengthens this connection, Jethro's role as priest of Midian, and his performance of Yahwistic rituals that later appear within early Israelite practice, contributes to the scholarly view that the Kenites were early Yahwists whose desert god was subsequently adopted, reshaped, and elevated by emerging Israelite communities. This historical background exposes a major chronological contradiction within the biblical narrative. The Bible portrays Yahweh speaking to Abraham before Esau or Midian are born. Yet archaeological and textual evidence indicates Yahweh originated as a deity of southern Edomite Midianite Kenite groups, peoples whom the biblical genealogies claim descend from Abraham's own sons and grandson. In this framework, a deity tied to a grandson's tribe appears centuries before that tribe exists, creating an anachronism within the narrative timeline. When viewed through historical critical scholarship, this mismatch shows that the story of Abraham's call by Yahweh is a later theological construction, merging originally independent traditions, Amorite ancestral legends, Canaanite settlement history, and southern desert Yahweh worship. These elements were stitched together into a single genealogical narrative to create a unified sacred origin story for Israel. As a result, the biblical account cannot be read as coherent literal history, but rather as a composite text reflecting layered religious, cultural, and political developments over centuries. Abraham's religious transformation involved rejecting Amorite pagan gods and worshipping Yahweh, who later, in Israelite religion, integrated attributes of El, the Canaanite high god, and, symbolically, aspects of 𝗏𝗏𝗱𝗏𝗏. Abraham is regarded in the Abrahamic religions as the patriarch of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, because these faiths trace spiritual lineage to his covenant with God, called Yahweh in Judaism and Christianity, and Allah in Islam. Religious and cultural syncretism occurred through migration, trade, and intermarriage in the ancient Near East. Deities and myths from Mesopotamia, a region of overlapping pagan religions, were transmitted to the Canaanites and other civilizations. The Phoenicians, as maritime traders, spread elements of their religion, including the veneration of 𝗏𝗏𝗱𝗏𝗏, to North Africa, Carthage, and influenced other cultures. For example, Egyptian Set and Isis were associated with Baal and Astarte, while aspects of Yahweh were syncretized with Roman Saturn and Greek Chronos in various contexts. This pattern of religious syncretism even echoes into modern cultural symbols. For instance, Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., widely assumed to be named after the Roman Capitoline Hill, was itself historically associated with Mons Saturnius, a hill dedicated to the god Saturn. On September 18, 1793, President George Washington, together with Masonic lodges from Maryland and Virginia, laid the cornerstone of the U.S. Capitol. The ceremony included a formal procession, the use of Masonic tools, and ritualistic offerings, ritual elements that echo ancient practices associated with Saturn, the Roman god linked to time, order, and governance. The Capitol building itself incorporates numerous symbols, reflecting the influence of Freemasonry on the nation's founding, including the Eye of Providence, geometric patterns, and other designs, which can be seen as modern continuations of Saturnian motifs. These symbols are generally interpreted as representing Enlightenment ideals, such as order, morality, and liberty, but they also resonate with the ancient archetype of Saturn as a guardian of structure and civic order. The Hebrews emerged as Amorite-descended people living in Canaan and surrounding regions, sharing language and cultural traits with Canaanites, including alphabetic writing. Yahweh worship gradually merged with Hebrew identity as tribal confederations coalesced into the early Israelite society. Historical and archaeological sources indicate that in some early contexts, child sacrifice was practiced in the ancient Near East, sometimes to 𝗆𝗆𝗆, Molech or Yahweh. There are biblical accounts that condemn such practices among the Canaanites and occasionally among Israelites, reflecting tension between earlier religious norms and emerging Yahwistic monotheism. As the Israelite identity coalesced around Yahweh worship, the later emergence of Christianity, rooted in these Amorite Canaanite Abrahamic traditions, expanded far beyond the Levant. During the medieval and early modern periods, Christianity became closely intertwined with political and state authority in Europe and in colonial expansions abroad. In these contexts, the Church and allied political powers systematically used Christianity to consolidate control, enforce religious conformity, and expand influence. In the Americas, Africa, and Oceania, Christian missions often operated as part of state-backed colonial projects. These efforts included forced conversion, destruction of indigenous sacred sites, suppression of local religious practices, and imposition of European cultural norms, frequently accompanied by terror, violence, coercion, rape and murder. These processes were institutional and systemic, reflecting the integration of religious authority with political and military power, rather than isolated or occasional incidents. Early Judaism, in contrast, remained primarily localized in the Levant and did not engage in widespread proselytism. Christianity, emerging from Jewish traditions, became a proselytizing religion that spread across the Roman Empire and beyond. While some populations adopted Christianity voluntarily, its expansion in many historical periods was embedded in political, military, and colonial structures, which contributed to the suppression or replacement of pre-existing religious practices. Historical records document that the expansion of Christianity, particularly in colonized regions, resulted in the marginalization or eradication of indigenous religions. This included the replacement of local spiritual practices with Christian norms, destruction of sacred sites, and the reorganization of cultural systems around European models. These changes were often accompanied by coercion, legal enforcement, and, at times, terror and violence. While not all interactions were violent, the historical evidence demonstrates that Christianity, when linked to political and colonial power, functioned as an instrument of cultural transformation and religious imposition, profoundly altering the spiritual, social, and cultural landscapes of the societies it reached. In the modern era, the long history of Christian expansion, suppression of indigenous religions, and destruction of pre-Christian traditions has become the focus of renewed academic study and public awareness. Descendants of groups whose belief systems were marginalized, such as Europeans whose pre-Christian religions were replaced by state-backed Christianization, or indigenous peoples in the Americas and elsewhere whose spiritual practices were suppressed during colonial rule, are increasingly examining the cultural, spiritual, and social impact of those historical processes. This has contributed to a broader movement of people reclaiming, reconstructing, or reviving pre-Christian or non-Christian traditions as a response to centuries of cultural loss and as an assertion of identity. Contemporary revival movements, ranging from modern paganism and Druidry to reconstructed polytheisms and occult traditions, often frame their resurgence as a rebalancing of historical narratives. Many adherents emphasize reclaiming ancestral practices, restoring erased cultural lineages, or challenging the dominance of Christian frameworks in Western society. These movements are also shaped by broader social currents, including increasing secularization, the decline of institutional religious authority, and a growing interest in spiritual systems outside mainstream monotheism. In this context, some individuals articulate their revival of ancestral or esoteric traditions in oppositional terms, viewing the resurgence of suppressed religions as a symbolic reversal of historical injustice. These expressions manifest as cultural or ideological resistance, as organized or clandestine efforts to harm Christian populations. Examples include mass immigration. The dynamics are better understood as part of a larger shift in which previously marginalized spiritualities, witchcraft traditions, ceremonial magic, paganism, and other non-Christian paths are gaining visibility and legitimacy in a diverse and pluralistic global society. These modern movements represent a complex interaction of identity reclamation, historical memory, critique of institutional religion, and renewed interest in pre-Christian spiritual frameworks. The result is a cultural landscape in which Christianity remains influential but no longer holds uncontested authority, and where once suppressed traditions are actively being revived, studied, and practiced openly.